There are people who make their entire very good living on tracking and projecting trends and patterns that they see in the economy and politics and geopolitics and in cultural shifts and styles, and there's lots to look at for all that. And those patterns, those trends, they do help give you a sense of where we're going. And they're not all right always, but many of them have a pretty good handle on where we're going. Andy Stanley wrote a really neat book called The Principle of the Path. I just reread it because it's just good to be reminded. And it comes down to three simple things. Well, simple to say. First, your attention determines your direction. Your direction determines your destination. Trends are directions. They get our attention, right? We do these trendy things because something got our attention. That sets a direction, and that leads to a destination. That is wisdom for every aspect of your life. And I think one of the reasons that Paul wrote to Timothy in 2 Timothy 1:13, what you heard from me keep as the pattern of sound teaching, is because he knew your attention determines your direction, and your direction determines your destination. And so we've been talking about what was that pattern? Well, now I look at it in a couple of different ways. One way is I think I am less inclined to think Paul is saying, Timothy, do it the way I did it. Use my terminologies, use my gestures, use my inflections. Now, I look around and it's always been this way. There are preachers and teachers that really do imitate their heroes. And in some ways, all of us imitate our heroes, but I don't think that's what Paul was saying. I think he's on to the principle side, the patterns of principle in his life, and I think they come down to really just a few things. We've talked about there is the Word, Scripture. There is the discipline of reading, studying, absorbing Scripture. There is the pattern of prayer and generating, or that's not the right word, creating within our patterns this habit, which patterns are habits. Habits are patterns. But the habit of doing what Paul said in 1 Thessalonians, pray without ceasing, pray continuously or continually. And you can split hairs on that, but the point is, have this dialogue constantly going with Christ, with Jesus in your heart. I think there's this also. One of Paul's patterns, one of his habits, was community and deepening relationships. In our world today, community's gotten a lot of press. And I mean even outside of the religious church community. There are a lot of manufacturers of products who want you to know they are so concerned for their communities. And some of them probably are. So we've got that going. We have, we talk about we are more community-minded on the theoretical level, but I think we are less community-minded on the street level. And here's what I mean by that. We don't, our neighborhoods, and maybe this is just because I'm old, my kids are all grown up, but our neighborhoods, when I was growing up, my mom and dad and we knew really everybody on our block. We looked out for each other. And as kids, we played in the summertime, sun up to sundown, with kids in our neighborhood, our community. Well, I don't see that happening very much anymore, and there's a whole bunch of reasons for it. I'm not even going to go into what I believe are pretty thorough and universal in America, even in Oklahoma, in the heartland, where our values are more like the old days than lots of other places in the world. But still, community, I don't know, it's really left to the individual. We just two quick things. In the old days, I mean back, well, I don't just mean 30, 40 years ago. I mean 50, 60 years ago. If you look at houses that were built 60 or 70 years ago, 50 years ago even, they have a larger front porch. And one of the reasons was 60 years ago, didn't have much air conditioning. It certainly didn't have central in most residential dwellings, and it was just too expensive. So the front porch was where the porch swing was, and other outdoor seating, because you could catch the breeze, and it was cooler than being in the house. One of the advantages of that is your neighbor was doing that too. And so you would encounter each other a lot more often. Those have gone away. Our front porch in this house, it's a lovely house, but you couldn't get 3 fat people on my front porch. There's no way you could get a porch swing or a chair to sit in there. It isn't designed for that. And I think that's created, that's a dynamic that has, I don't think it's the whole generation point of it, but I think it has influenced the fact that we don't encounter our neighbors very much unless we just intentionally do it. Well, now I will say, even 67 years ago, if you were an introvert, you could avoid your neighbors. But it was not the same as today. And the second thing that I think of is the automatic garage door opener. Now, there are people who have misunderstood the function of a garage. It is a covered junk heap for a lot of people. But for a lot of people, you have an automatic garage door opener so that you can pull your car in and then push the button and close the door, and you never have to encounter the elements. That's a problem. Listen, if it's exceedingly cold, exceedingly hot, pardon me, or raining horizontally, that's a really good thing. But it's made it much, much easier to never encounter your neighbor. So community has become different, I think much different. There's a trend back toward community. It seems to be, 20 years ago, it was around places like Starbucks, where you could go have a cup of coffee, encounter people, meet with friends. These things used to happen in our homes. Well, okay. That's not the kind of community Paul built. Number one, those things didn't exist in Paul's day, but he built deepening foundational relationships with people. Timothy was one of those people. He invested his life in people. He didn't isolate himself and insulate himself from real life and the real needs that real people had all around him. This is important. I think I'm gonna use my iPad here. There were surely other patterns or other pieces of the pattern of sound teaching that Paul was pointing to with Timothy, but I look at Acts chapter 2, verse 42, and here's the pattern of the first church. And they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching, to the fellowship, to the breaking of bread and prayers. Well, the apostles' teaching, we have a terrific advantage that they never enjoyed. We have it collected for us. And I got it on my phone, on my iPad, and my computer, and I've got a shelf full of printed Bibles. They didn't have that. The apostles' teaching, having a bad hair day today, and I'm too vain to just let it go. The apostles' teaching, we share in that, or do we very often? And the apostles' teaching for us is in the Bible. A second was to the fellowship. One of the things about this idea of fellowship is, and I'm taking other people's word for it who are Greek scholars, because I am not, but the word there for fellowship is koinonia, and that is the Greek word for community. This commonality. A little later in the book of Acts, Luke records that people pooled their resources for the sake of benefiting the fellowship. And so that it was not just, we use the term fellowship pretty lightly, but this is connectedness. And to the breaking of bread, there's two possible meanings, and I think it would have been both. One is that the Lord's Supper, communion, was often called the breaking of the bread, following the pattern of Jesus on the night he was betrayed. A second possible meaning is that they sat down and ate together. In 1 Corinthians, we get a window into the fact that one of the practices of the church was that they shared a meal together, and some in Corinth had begun to abuse that, and it became, it was just a gluttonous feast and drinking to excess. That's not what this was. And then to the prayers. So you've got, let's start from the back. Prayer, breaking of bread, I would call that, Protestants don't like this term, sacramental. Then you have the fellowship, that's community. And then last is the teaching, the apostles' teaching. Those four things ought to happen in a believer's life. One of the things Luke records in that same chapter, verse 46, day by day, attending the temple together and breaking bread in their homes, they received their food with glad and generous hearts, praising God and having favor with all the people. That's the pattern. And that's, honestly, in our world, that's a little bit of a tough pattern to follow. because we're busy people. Busy people. Okay, actually going to move on next time on Soul Care with Stevie Boy.